The rain had been falling for 3 days straight. It wasn't the kind of rain that announced itself with thunder and drama. It was quiet, persistent, the type that seeped into your bones and made the whole city feel like it was drowning in slow motion. The streets of Newark glistened under the amber glow of streetlights, reflections stretching and distorting in the puddles that had claimed every corner and curb. Emily Carter pulled her truck into the service entrance of Hillside Cemetery just after 6 in the evening. The wipers scraped across the windshield in a rhythm she'd long stopped noticing. She cut the engine and sat for a moment, staring out at the rows of headstones that disappeared into the gray mist. Some people found cemeteries unsettling. Emily found them honest. The dead didn't lie. They didn't pretend. They didn't ask for anything they hadn't already given. She grabbed her work jacket from the passenger seat, heavy canvas worn at the elbows with her name stitched across the chest in fading thread. 30 years old, and this jacket had seen more of her life than most people. She pulled it on, flipped up the collar against the rain, and stepped out into the wet evening air. The Rossi burial was scheduled for 7 o'clock. She'd been briefed that morning by Martin, the cemetery director. Simple service, minimal attendance expected. Plot already prepared on the east ridge overlooking the older section of the grounds. Rossi family, Martin had said, his voice carefully neutral. They've been prominent in the area for a long time. Emily knew what that meant. She'd lived in Newark her entire life. You didn't grow up here without understanding the unspoken hierarchies, the names that carried weight, the businesses that operated in the margins between legal and something else entirely. The Rossi name was one of those, spoken in whispers, associated with respect born from fear rather than admiration. But Emily didn't concern herself with the politics of the living. Her job was to prepare the earth to receive the dead, to ensure that final transition happened with dignity. Whatever Vincent Rossi had been in life, he deserved that much in death. She made her way up the winding path toward the east ridge, her boots squelching in the soft ground. The grave had been dug that morning by the crew, a perfect rectangle carved into the hillside. She checked the measurements, ensured the lowering device was secure, tested the straps. Everything had to be right. There were no second chances in her line of work. By 6:40, the funeral procession began to arrive. Emily positioned herself at a respectful distance near the maintenance shed that offered a partial view of the burial site. It wasn't her place to stand among the mourners, but she needed to be close enough to assist if anything went wrong with the equipment. The hearse pulled up first, sleek and black, water streaming down its polished sides. 2 men in dark suits emerged. Not pallbearers exactly, but something else. They moved with a precision that spoke of awareness, of constant vigilance. One scanned the perimeter while the other opened the rear door. Then came the other cars. Emily expected a procession, a line of vehicles carrying family, friends, business associates. Instead, there were only 3 more cars, 5 total, including the hearse. She frowned slightly. For someone supposedly prominent, it seemed sparse. The funeral director from Battaglia and Sons appeared, a short man named Angelo who'd been in the business for 40 years. He moved with practiced efficiency, coordinating with the 2 suited men to transfer the casket. It was expensive. She could tell from the mahogany finish, the brass handles that caught what little light penetrated the clouds. But as the casket was positioned on the lowering device, Emily realized something that made her chest tighten with an unexpected sadness. There was no one else coming. The small gathering, if you could call it that, consisted of Angelo, the 2 security men, a priest who looked uncomfortable and kept checking his watch, and a woman in her 60s who might have been a secretary or distant relative. She stood apart from the others, clutching a black umbrella, her expression carefully blank. No family, no friends, no tearful widow or grieving children. Vincent Rossi was being buried in silence, witnessed by employees and strangers. The priest began the committal service, his words carrying across the wet grass but barely audible over the rain. Emily found herself listening despite herself, caught by the profound loneliness of the scene. She'd worked hundreds of burials, maybe thousands at this point, but there was something particularly haunting about this one. Did anyone actually mourn this man? She was so absorbed in the ceremony that she almost missed the arrival of the final car. It was a black sedan, newer than the others, and it pulled up with deliberate slowness. The engine idled for nearly a minute before the door finally opened. The man who emerged made Emily's breath catch, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of presence he carried. He was tall, probably 6'2", with dark hair starting to gray at the temples despite appearing to be in his early 40s. He wore a charcoal suit that fit perfectly, tailored to accommodate broad shoulders that spoke of someone who maintained physical discipline. But it was his face that arrested her attention. Strong features, a jaw that could have been carved from stone, and eyes that even from a distance seemed to hold an exhaustion that went beyond lack of sleep. This, she realized, must be the son. Michael Rossi moved toward the gravesite with measured steps, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. He didn't carry an umbrella, letting the rain soak into his shoulders and hair as if he didn't notice or didn't care. The two security men straightened slightly at his approach but didn't speak. Even the priest seemed to pause mid-prayer, aware of the shift in atmosphere. Michael stopped at the edge of the grave, looking down at the casket as if he were studying a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. There was no tears, no visible grief, just an intense, focused attention that felt more like an interrogation than a goodbye. Emily watched him from her position near the shed, fascinated despite herself. She'd seen every possible expression of grief in her decade working here. The wild sobbing of parents who'd lost children, the stoic silence of veterans burying their brothers, the confused anger of those left behind too soon. But this was different. Michael Rossi looked at his father's casket the way someone might look at a contract they were being forced to sign, with resignation, calculation, and something that might have been resentment. The priest completed the service quickly, clearly eager to escape the rain and the oppressive atmosphere. He offered brief condolences to Michael, who accepted them with a slight nod but no words. The older woman approached next, murmured something Emily couldn't hear, and then retreated to her car with obvious relief. Within minutes, it was over. The small group dispersed like smoke, leaving only Michael, the two security men, and Angelo, who was speaking quietly with the funeral home driver. This was Emily's cue. She stepped forward, making her presence known but not intrusive, waiting for the signal that they were ready to proceed with the actual burial. Angelo caught her eye and nodded. As the funeral party prepared to leave, Emily moved to the lowering device. This was the part most people didn't stay for, the mechanical reality of Earth receiving Earth, the final descent into darkness. Some families wanted to witness it, to throw flowers or handfuls of soil as the casket lowered. Most couldn't bear it and left before this moment. She expected Michael to leave with the others. He didn't. Instead, he stood perfectly still at the grave's edge, watching as Emily began the process of lowering the casket. The hydraulic system hummed softly, a sound that always seemed too modern, too clinical for the ancient ritual it facilitated. The mahogany box descended smoothly, inch by inch, into the earth. Emily worked with practiced efficiency, her movements careful and respectful. She was aware of Michael's eyes on her, but she didn't let it disturb her focus. She'd learned long ago that grief took many forms, and some people needed to witness this final act to accept the reality of death. When the casket reached the bottom, she secured the straps and stepped back. Protocol suggested she should leave now, return later with the crew to fill the grave. But something about the scene, the rain, the solitude, the palpable weight of unspoken things, made her hesitate. Michael continued to stare into the grave, his hands still in his pockets, rain streaming down his face. In the fading light, he looked less like a powerful figure, and more like a man standing at the edge of an abyss, trying to decide if he should jump. Emily picked up the shovel she'd left propped against a nearby tree. She didn't have to do this now. The crew could handle it tomorrow morning. But something told her this grave shouldn't be left open overnight. Some burials demanded immediate completion. She drove the shovel into the mound of excavated earth and tossed the first load into the grave. The soil hit the casket with a hollow thump that echoed in the quiet evening. She continued, establishing a steady rhythm, the physical work warming her against the rain's chill. After several minutes, she sensed movement and looked up. Michael had taken off his suit jacket, folded it carefully, and set it on a nearby bench. He approached the mound of earth, and for a moment Emily thought he might say something. Instead, he simply picked up the second shovel, the one she kept for family members who wanted to participate, and began to dig. They worked in silence. The only sounds the scrape of metal against earth, the rain, and the distant hum of traffic from the highway below. Emily was surprised by his technique. He knew how to work a shovel, how to use his legs rather than just his back, how to pace himself. This wasn't a man who'd spent his entire life behind a desk. The grave filled slowly. Emily had done this alone countless times, but there was something almost meditative about sharing the task. No words were necessary. They weren't burying Vincent Rossi together so much as they were completing a ritual that felt older than language. When the grave was half filled, Michael stopped. He leaned on the shovel, breathing heavily, staring down at the diminishing view of the casket. Emily paused too, giving him space. "No one came," he said finally. His voice was deeper than she'd expected, rough around the edges like he hadn't spoken in days. Emily didn't reply immediately. She'd learned that sometimes people spoke not because they wanted answers, but because they needed to hear their own thoughts out loud. 30 years in this city, Michael continued, still looking at the grave. 30 years of business, of deals, of relationships, and no one came to say goodbye. "I'm here," Emily said quietly. He turned to look at her then, really look at her for the first time. His eyes were dark brown, almost black in the fading light, and they held an intelligence that felt like it could see through pretense. She met his gaze steadily, neither challenging nor submissive, just present. "You don't count," he said, but there was no harshness in it. "You're paid to be here." "I'm paid to bury him," Emily corrected. "Nobody pays me to stay after. That's a choice." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or a recognition of some kind. He studied her more closely. The work jacket with her name stitched across it, the practical boots, the dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, the face that was striking not because of conventional beauty, but because of the directness in her eyes. "Why did you stay?" he asked. Emily considered the question. She could give him the easy answer, that it was raining, that open graves shouldn't be left overnight, that it was simply part of her job. But standing here in the rain, sharing this strange intimacy of physical labor and grief, she found herself giving him the truth instead. "Because everyone deserves at least one person who witnesses their leaving," she said, "even if they didn't deserve much else." Michael's expression shifted. Something in his jaw loosened, and for just a moment he looked less like stone and more like flesh. He nodded slowly, as if she'd confirmed something he'd suspected but couldn't articulate. They returned to work without further conversation, filling the grave until the earth was mounded slightly above ground level. It would settle over time. Emily used the back of the shovel to pat the soil down, creating a smooth surface that would be easier to seed later. When it was done, they stood on opposite sides of the grave, both muddy, both soaked through, both somehow changed by the shared experience. "I don't even know your name," Michael said. "Emily. Emily Carter. Michael Rossi." He extended his hand across the grave. She hesitated only briefly before reaching across to shake it. His grip was firm, but not aggressive, his hand rough with calluses that spoke of work more physical than she'd expected. They held the handshake a moment longer than strictly necessary, a connection that felt significant in ways neither could quite name. "Thank you," he said, "for staying." "You're welcome." He collected his jacket from the bench, now as wet as the rest of him, and turned to leave. But after a few steps he stopped and looked back. Is this what you do? Bury people?" "It's what I do," Emily confirmed. "Someone has to. And you chose this?" "I chose work that matters. Work that's honest." She paused, then added, "The dead don't lie to you. They don't pretend to be something they're not. There's a peace in that." Michael considered this, rain continuing to stream down his face. In the distance, one of his security men was standing by the sedan, waiting patiently but visibly uncomfortable in the wet evening. "I should let you go," Emily said, sensing the moment coming to an end. But Michael didn't move. He stood there looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, curiosity mixed with something deeper, something that might have been longing. "I'll probably be back," he said finally. "To visit. Most people don't right away," Emily observed. "They need time. I'm not most people. I can see that." The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile but acknowledgement of her observation. Then he turned and walked toward the waiting car, his stride purposeful despite the emotional weight he must be carrying. Emily watched him go, the sedan's taillights disappearing into the rain and mist. She stood alone by the fresh grave, feeling the cold finally seeping through her jacket, wondering about the man who'd just left, and why his presence had affected her in ways she didn't quite understand. She gathered her tools and started back toward her truck, but she couldn't resist one last look at Vincent Rossi's grave. In a few days there would be a headstone. The grass would grow back. Eventually, it would look like every other grave in this section, peaceful, permanent, unremarkable. But Emily knew she'd remember this one, not because of who was buried there, but because of who had stood in the rain to witness it. As she drove out of the cemetery, her headlights cutting through the darkness, she thought about Michael's words. No one came. In her experience, that said everything about a life. Not the wealth, not the power, not the reputation, but who showed up when you took your final bow. Vincent Rossi had built something in this city, something significant enough that people whispered his name, but in the end he died alone, mourned by no one, buried in silence. And his son had noticed, had cared enough to stay, to work, to acknowledge the profound loneliness of that ending. Emily had seen a lot of death. She'd witnessed every kind of goodbye. But she'd never seen someone quite like Michael Rossi, a man who looked at his father's grave with neither love nor hate, but with a complexity she recognized because she carried something similar herself. The rain continued as she drove home through Newark's quiet streets. Somewhere in the city, Michael was returning to whatever life awaited him, and somewhere in Hillside Cemetery, Vincent Rossi rested in the ground, his silence now permanent, his story finished. But Emily had a feeling that the story she'd just become part of, whatever it was, had only just begun. The dead didn't lie, but the living were full of mysteries, and Michael Rossi was a mystery she suspected she'd see again soon. The rain finally stopped on the fourth day. Emily noticed it first thing Tuesday morning when she stepped out of her apartment building in the Ironbound district. The sky was still gray, heavy with clouds that threatened to resume their assault at any moment, but for now, the air was merely damp rather than drenched. She breathed in deeply, catching the scent of wet pavement mixed with the bread baking at the Portuguese bakery on the corner. Her apartment was small, a one-bedroom on the third floor of a building that had seen better decades, but it was hers. The rent was manageable on her cemetery salary, and the neighborhood had a rhythm she understood. Working families, immigrant communities building their version of the American dream, people who minded their own business but would help if you needed it. She grabbed her thermos of coffee and headed to her truck, already mentally reviewing the day's schedule. 2 morning burials, routine maintenance on the older sections, and a meeting with Martin about expanding the Veterans Memorial Garden. Normal work. Honest work. But as she drove toward Hillside Cemetery, she found her thoughts drifting back to Saturday night, to the solitary figure of Michael Rossi, standing in the rain, filling his father's grave with his own hands. "I'll probably be back," he'd said. She wondered if he'd meant it, or if it was just something people said in moments of raw emotion, promises made to themselves that daylight would erase. The cemetery looked different without the rain, still somber but less oppressive. Morning light filtered through the clouds, casting everything in shades of silver and gray. Emily parked in her usual spot and gathered her equipment, ready to start the day. She had learned long ago not to expect surprises in her work. Death followed patterns, rhythms as predictable as seasons. Tuesday meant the weekend burials had settled, families had returned to their routines, and the cemetery returned to its quiet purpose. So when she drove past Vincent Rossi's grave on her way to the maintenance shed and saw a figure standing beside it, she felt her heart skip in a way that caught her off guard. Michael stood with his hands in the pockets of a different suit, charcoal gray, no tie this time, the top button of his white shirt undone. He wasn't doing anything dramatic, just standing there, looking at the mound of earth that would eventually be marked with stone and memory. Emily slowed her truck but didn't stop. It wasn't her place to interrupt private moments, but she filed the observation away. He'd come back after only 3 days. That was unusual. Most people needed weeks, sometimes months, before they could face the finality of a grave. She went about her morning duties, preparing for the first burial service, but her attention kept drifting toward the East Ridge, toward that solitary figure who seemed content to simply stand and remember, or perhaps to wrestle with things that had no easy resolution. An hour later, as she was checking the irrigation system near the older section, she heard footsteps on the gravel path behind her. "You work early," Michael's voice said. Emily straightened, turning to face him. In the daylight, she could see details she'd missed in the rain. The fine lines around his eyes that spoke of stress rather than age. The precise way he carried himself, balanced, aware, like someone who'd learned to always know where the exits were. "Death doesn't keep office hours," she replied. "Neither do I." He nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "I wanted to thank you again, for Saturday." "You already did. I know, but I meant it this time." He paused, seeming to search for words. "That night it was complicated. I didn't handle it well." Emily wiped her hands on her work pants, buying herself a moment to think. There was something disarming about his honesty, the way he acknowledged his own uncertainty. It wasn't what she'd expected from someone with his reputation. "You showed up," she said. You stayed. You did the work. That's handling it better than most people manage. Most people's fathers aren't. He trailed off, recalibrating. Most people had different relationships with their fathers. Did you hate him? The question came out before Emily could stop it. Too direct, too personal. She waited for him to shut down, to walk away, to remind her that his family history was none of her business. Instead, he laughed, a short, sharp sound without much humor in it. I don't know, he said, and the admission seemed to surprise even him. I spent so much of my life trying to be what he wanted, then trying not to be what he wanted, that I'm not sure I ever figured out what I actually felt about him. Hatred would at least be clean, simple. Emily understood that more than he could know. Her own family history was a tangle of complicated feelings she'd spent years trying to sort through. It was part of why she'd ended up here, among the dead, where relationships were already finished and required no further navigation. He's gone now, she offered. You don't have to figure it out anymore. Don't I? Michael looked back toward his father's grave. I inherited everything he built. His business, his reputation, his connections. I can't escape what he was just because he's not here to enforce it anymore. There was something vulnerable in that statement, a crack in the careful facade he presented to the world. Emily recognized it because she'd seen it in the mirror often enough, the weight of other people's expectations, the suffocation of inherited identities. You could walk away, she said, though she suspected it wasn't that simple. Could I? He met her eyes, and she saw the exhaustion there again, the bone-deep weariness of someone who'd been fighting battles on multiple fronts for too long. When do you take your lunch break? The question caught her off guard. What? Lunch. When do you eat? Usually around noon. There's a bench by the pond where Would you let me buy you lunch? Somewhere not here. He gestured at the surrounding graves. Somewhere with living people. Emily hesitated. Every instinct told her this was a complication she didn't need. She knew who the Rossi family was, what they represented. Getting involved, even in something as innocent as lunch, meant stepping into a world she'd spent her entire life avoiding. But there was something in his eyes, a quiet desperation that wasn't demanding or manipulative, just lonely. She recognized it, because she felt it too, in the spaces between work and sleep, in the silent apartment and the solitary meals. There's a diner on Market Street, she heard herself say. Felipe's. They have good sandwiches. Noon? Noon. He nodded, something like relief crossing his features. Thank you. Then he was walking away back toward his car. A different one today, she noticed, black but more modest than Saturday's sedan. She watched him go, wondering what she'd just agreed to and why her heart was beating faster than it should. Felipe's Diner had been a neighborhood fixture for 35 years, the kind of place that served breakfast all day and knew its regulars by name. Emily arrived first, claiming a booth near the back, not hiding exactly, but not advertising either. She still wore her work clothes, hadn't bothered to change or clean up beyond washing her hands. This wasn't a date. It was just lunch with someone who'd happened to be at the cemetery. She almost believed it. Michael arrived exactly at noon, sliding into the booth across from her with an ease that suggested he was comfortable in any environment. He'd removed his jacket, rolled up his shirt sleeves, and somehow managed to look both professional and approachable. You weren't kidding about the living people, Emily observed. The diner was packed with the lunch crowd, construction workers, office employees, elderly couples lingering over coffee and conversation. It's been a while since I ate somewhere like this, Michael admitted, looking around with what seemed like genuine interest. Most of my meals are in restaurants where the menus don't have prices. Fancy. Isolating. He picked up the laminated menu, studying it with the same intensity she'd seen him apply to his father's grave. What's good? Everything. But the Cuban sandwich is legendary. They ordered. Cuban for her, the same for him. Coffee for both. The waitress, Rosa, knew Emily, and gave Michael an appraising look that was more protective than curious. Emily had been coming here for years, and the staff had adopted her as one of their own. When Rosa left, an awkward silence settled between them. Emily sipped her water. Michael drummed his fingers lightly on the table, and they both seemed to realize simultaneously that neither of them was particularly good at small talk. So, Michael started, then stopped. I don't actually know how to do this. Do what? Have a normal conversation. Without an agenda. Without, he gestured vaguely, without it being a negotiation. Emily set down her water glass. We could start with the basics. Where did you grow up? Here. Newark. The North Ward, mostly. Catholic schools, uncomfortable uniforms, nuns who weren't afraid to use rulers as disciplinary tools. He paused. You? Ironbound. Public schools, uncomfortable uniforms of a different kind. Teachers who were too overwhelmed to care much about discipline. She smiled slightly. I'm guessing our childhoods were very different. Probably in some ways. Similar in others. Michael leaned back as Rosa delivered their coffee. Did you always want to work in a cemetery? God, no, I wanted to be a teacher, actually. Elementary school. I liked the idea of helping kids figure out the world before it got too complicated. She wrapped her hands around the warm mug. But life had other plans. My mother got sick when I was 22, right after I finished my degree. Cervical cancer. She needed full-time care, so teaching took a back seat. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. She died when I was 25. By then, I'd been away from teaching for 3 years. Lost my student loan deferment, had medical bills to pay. The cemetery was hiring, and it turned out I was good at it. The work felt honest, important, so I stayed. Michael studied her with those dark, intelligent eyes. Do you regret it? Sometimes, but mostly no. Teaching would have been about shaping futures. This is about honoring endings. Both matter. Their sandwiches arrived, and for a few minutes, they ate in companionable silence. The Cuban was as good as Emily had promised. Roasted pork, ham, Swiss cheese, pickles, and mustard pressed between crispy bread. Simple, perfect, real. What about you? Emily asked after a while. Did you want to go into the family business? Michael's expression darkened slightly. Want isn't the right word. It was expected. I was groomed for it from the time I could walk. My father believed in legacy, in blood loyalty. The idea that I might want something different wasn't even a possibility he considered. But you did want something different? He was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee mug in slow circles. I wanted to be an architect. Buildings, spaces, how people move through them. I loved the idea of creating structures that would outlast me, that would serve purposes I could be proud of. He laughed bitterly. Instead, I inherited a different kind of structure. One that serves purposes I'm not sure I believe in anymore. Emily heard the careful way he spoke, the words he chose and the ones he avoided. She knew he was talking about more than a conventional business, but she appreciated that he wasn't forcing her to acknowledge what they both understood. It's not too late, she said, to want something different, to choose it. Isn't it? He met her eyes. Some legacies don't let you walk away. Any legacy can be changed. It just requires courage and willingness to disappoint people. And if those people are dangerous when disappointed, there it was, the acknowledgement of the reality between them, spoken quietly enough that it wouldn't carry to other tables, but clearly enough that there was no mistaking the meaning. Emily considered her response carefully. She could retreat into platitudes, or she could offer him the same honesty he was offering her. Then you have to decide if living authentically is worth the risk, she said. Only you can make that calculation. Michael leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower. What if living authentically means putting other people at risk? People who didn't choose this life? Are you asking me if I'm afraid of you? Maybe. Are you? Emily thought about it, really thought about it. She looked at the man across from her, powerful, complicated, carrying burdens she couldn't fully understand. She thought about the reputation that preceded him, the whispers that followed his name. No, she said finally. I'm not afraid of you. I've spent 10 years with the dead, Michael. I've seen what violence looks like, what it leaves behind. I've buried children, victims, people whose lives were cut short by cruelty. If you were that kind of person, I'd know. I'd feel it. You can't be sure. I'm sure enough. She held his gaze. You stood in the rain filling your father's grave with your own hands. You came back to visit after 3 days. You're sitting in a diner with a cemetery worker trying to figure out if you're allowed to want a different life. Those aren't the actions of someone I need to fear. Something in his expression cracked. Not breaking, but opening. For a moment she saw past the careful control to the person underneath. Exhausted, lonely, desperate for someone to see him as something other than his surname and reputation. I don't know why I feel like I can talk to you, he admitted. We just met. You don't know anything about me. Sometimes strangers are easier. We don't have expectations beyond the moment. Is that what we are? Strangers? I don't know what we are, Emily said honestly. But I don't think we're just strangers anymore. They finished their lunch, the conversation shifting to safer topics, books they'd read, places in the city that held memories, the small details that build understanding between people. Michael had a sharp wit when he let his guard down, and Emily found herself laughing more than she had in months. When Rosa brought the check, Michael grabbed it before Emily could protest. "Next time is on me," Emily said. "Next time?" He raised an eyebrow, but she could see the hope behind the question. "Unless you don't want there to be a next time." "I want there to be a next time." He said it simply, without pretense, and the directness of it made her heart skip again. They walked out into the gray afternoon, standing awkwardly on the sidewalk as pedestrians flowed around them. Michael's car was parked across the street, the modest black sedan, not a driver in sight. "I should get back to work," Emily said, though she found herself reluctant to end the moment. "Same." He didn't move. "Michael?" "Yeah?" "Whatever you're trying to figure out about your life, your legacy, you don't have to figure it out alone. You know that, right?" He looked at her with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable but somehow wasn't. "I barely know you. Sometimes that's exactly who you need. Someone without history, without agenda. Someone who sees you as a person first." "Is that what you see?" "It's all I see." He reached out then, slowly enough that she could have stepped back but didn't. His hand touched her shoulder briefly. Not possessive, not romantic, just connection. A reminder that he wasn't as alone as his father's empty wake had suggested. "Thank you," he said. "For lunch, for listening, for staying Saturday night, for all of it. You're welcome." He crossed the street to his car and she watched him go, feeling like something significant had just happened, though she couldn't quite name what. When his car disappeared into traffic, she turned back toward where her truck was parked, her mind full of questions she couldn't answer. Over the next 2 weeks, Michael returned to the cemetery 7 times. Emily didn't seek him out, didn't alter her routine to intersect with his visits, but she was always aware when he was there. A heightened sense that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with anticipation. Sometimes he came in the morning, standing by his father's grave for 20 minutes before leaving. Sometimes it was late afternoon, the fading light casting long shadows across the headstones. Once he came at dusk, and she only knew because she saw his car still in the lot when she was leaving for the day. He always nodded if their paths crossed, sometimes offered a few words about the weather or the cemetery's maintenance, but he didn't push for more lunches, didn't impose on her time. It was as if he'd found something he needed in this place, and her presence was part of it but not the whole of it. On the Thursday of the second week, Emily was repairing a sunken grave marker in the veterans section when she heard footsteps approaching. She looked up to find Michael standing a respectful distance away, hands in his pockets. A posture she was learning meant he was uncertain about something. "I'm not interrupting?" he asked. "Just finishing up." She tapped the marker one final time with her rubber mallet, checking its stability. "What brings you by on a Thursday afternoon? I thought you usually came in the mornings." "I had a meeting nearby. Thought I'd stop by." He paused. "Actually, that's not true. The meeting was across town. I came here specifically." Emily stood, brushing dirt from her knees. "Oh? I've been thinking about our conversation, about legacies and choices." He looked uncomfortable, like he was about to say something that cost him. "My father built something I'm not proud of, but it's also provided livelihoods for people, supported families, created stability in its own way. Walking away isn't as simple as just leaving. There are responsibilities, people who depend on." He trailed off and Emily waited. She'd learned that Michael needed space to find his words, that pushing only made him retreat. "I'm trying to figure out how to change things from inside," he continued. "How to take what exists and reshape it into something better. Something I can live with, but I don't know if that's possible or just naive." "It's not naive to want to do better than the generation before you," Emily said. "That's actually the whole point of legacy. Each generation builds on and improves what came before. And if the foundation is rotten, then you acknowledge it. You shore up what you can, rebuild what you must, and you're honest about the process. You don't pretend the rot wasn't there." Michael smiled slightly. "You make it sound simple. It's not simple. But it's possible. People change. Institutions change. It requires intention and courage, but it happens." They started walking together, a slow, meandering path through the cemetery. Emily pointed out various sections: the old potter's field now converted to gardens, the memorial to victims of industrial accidents, the new section dedicated to environmental conservation. "We all leave marks," she said. "The question is whether they're marks we'd want to be remembered for." "What mark do you want to leave?" Michael asked. Emily considered. I want people to feel that their loved ones were treated with dignity in their final journey, that someone cared enough to make that transition gentle. It's not grand, but it matters. It is grand, Michael corrected. It's possibly the most important work there is, helping people say goodbye. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the afternoon light beginning its slow fade toward evening. Emily found herself noticing small things, the way Michael's shoulders relaxed as they walked, how his expression softened when he looked at the older sections of the cemetery, the fact that he seemed more at peace here among the dead than she imagined he was in his regular life. "Can I ask you something?" he said eventually. "Sure. Why aren't you afraid of me?" "Really? Most people are, even when they try to hide it. But you never have been, not once." Emily stopped walking, turning to face him fully. "You want the truth? Always. I think you're exhausted from being afraid yourself, from living in a world where everyone wants something, where every interaction is a calculation, where showing weakness means vulnerability. You come here because the dead don't want anything from you. They're the only ones who let you just be." Michael stared at her, and she saw his jaw tighten with emotion he was fighting to control. "And I'm not afraid," she continued, "because I see someone who's trying. You could have buried your father and walked away. You could have continued exactly as he did without question. But instead, you keep coming back to this grave, standing there like you're trying to figure out who you are now that he's gone. That takes courage. That's not someone I need to fear. You see me more clearly than people who've known me for years," he said quietly. "Maybe they're looking at the wrong things." They stood there in the fading light, two people from completely different worlds who'd somehow found a connection in the most unlikely place. Emily knew this was complicated, knew there were questions she should ask and boundaries she should establish. But for now, in this moment, it felt simple. "I should go," Michael said, though he didn't move. "I have a dinner meeting I can't miss." "Okay. Can I come back? I mean, I know I can come to the cemetery, but can we do this again? The walking, the talking?" "Yes," Emily said, surprising herself with how much she wanted that. He smiled then, a real smile, not the careful half gesture she'd seen before. It transformed his face, made him look younger, less burdened. "Tomorrow?" he asked. "Tomorrow." He walked toward the parking lot, and Emily watched him go, feeling like she'd just made a decision that would change everything, though she couldn't yet see how. The sun finally broke through the clouds as she turned back to her work, casting golden light across the headstones. In the distance, she could hear birds singing their evening songs. Life and death always intertwined, and somewhere between the two, she and Michael were finding something neither had expected, something that might be called hope. The following 3 weeks unfolded with a rhythm Emily hadn't experienced in years. Michael came to the cemetery almost daily now, and their walks became a fixture in both their routines. Sometimes they talked for hours, other times they simply walked in companionable silence. He told her about his struggle to reshape his father's organization, carefully, without details that would implicate either of them, but honestly enough that she understood the weight he carried. She told him about the loneliness of her work, about finding her mother's journals after she died and discovering a woman she'd never really known, about the small apartment where she'd lived alone for 5 years, and how silence had become both comfort and prison. They met outside the cemetery too, coffee before her shift at the Portuguese bakery near her apartment, lunch at Felipe's, which became their regular spot. Once, on a Sunday when Emily had the day off, they drove to Branch Brook Park and walked among the cherry trees, their conversation ranging from childhood memories to philosophy, to the small observations that build intimacy between people. Emily knew she was crossing lines she'd never intended to approach. She knew Michael's world carried dangers she couldn't fully comprehend, but there was something between them that felt inevitable, like water finding its level, or roots growing toward light. On a Wednesday evening in late November, Michael picked her up after her shift in his car, the modest sedan he drove when he wanted anonymity. "I want to show you something," he said as she climbed in. "Mysterious. Trust me?" Emily looked at him, really looked at him. In the weeks since they'd met, she'd watched him transform. The exhaustion in his eyes had eased, replaced by something that might have been hope. He smiled more readily now, laughed at her observations about the absurdities of cemetery bureaucracy, shared pieces of himself he admitted he'd never shown anyone. "I trust you," she said. They drove through Newark as evening settled over the city, the streetlights beginning to glow against the darkening sky. Michael navigated with the ease of someone who knew these streets intimately, eventually pulling up in front of a building in the University Heights section. It was older construction, probably from the 1920s, with beautiful architectural details that had survived decades of neglect. The ground floor was clearly abandoned, windows boarded up, but the structure itself was sound. Good bones, as her mother would have said. "What is this?" Emily asked as they got out. "A possibility." Michael pulled out a key, unlocking the heavy door. "Come on." Inside, the space opened up into what had once been a commercial showroom. High ceilings, original tile work, big windows that would flood the space with natural light. It was dusty and clearly unused, but Emily could see the potential immediately. "My father bought this building 30 years ago," Michael explained, his voice echoing slightly in the empty space. "He used it for storage, for meetings he didn't want held in official locations. It's been sitting empty for 5 years." He led her through to the back, where a staircase climbed to the upper floors. They went up, Michael flipping light switches as they went. The second floor had been residential apartments once, divided into small units. The third floor was open, probably an artist's loft at some point, with skylights and exposed brick and hardwood floors that needed refinishing but were fundamentally beautiful. "Why are you showing me this?" Emily asked, though she was already falling in love with the space. Michael walked to the windows, looking out over the neighborhood. "I've been thinking about what you said, about leaving marks we'd want to be remembered for, about changing legacies from within." He turned to face her. "This building represents everything wrong with how my father operated. He took something beautiful and used it for purposes that served no one but himself. And now I own it, and I'm trying to figure out what to do with it. I thought maybe," he hesitated, a vulnerability in his expression that made her heart ache. "Maybe you'd help me see possibilities I can't see on my own." Emily walked through the space, her footsteps echoing on the old floors. She imagined the apartments restored and rented affordably to artists or young families. The ground floor as a community space, maybe a cafe or bookstore, something that served the neighborhood. The third floor as studios or workshops. "You could transform it," she said. "Make it serve the community instead of extracting from it." "That's what I was thinking." Michael joined her at the windows. "It's not much in the scheme of things. One building won't undo everything my father built. But it's a start, a first step toward something different." They stood close, shoulders almost touching, looking out at the city lights beginning to sparkle in the dusk. Emily was acutely aware of his presence beside her, of the warmth radiating from him, of how easy it would be to close the small distance between them. "Michael," she said quietly, "what are we doing?" "I don't know." He turned to face her. "I just know that when I'm with you, I can imagine being someone different, someone better. You don't need me for that. That person is already there. Maybe, but you help me see him." He reached out, his hand hovering near her face as if asking permission. Emily's breath caught. She knew if she leaned in, if she closed that distance, everything would change. They'd cross from whatever this was, this strange friendship built on cemetery walks and honest conversations, into something more complicated, more dangerous, more real. She leaned in. His hand cupped her cheek, warm and gentle, and for a moment they simply stood there breathing the same air, hearts pounding in synchronization. Then he kissed her, softly at first, questioning, giving her space to pull back if she wanted. She didn't want to. Emily kissed him back, her hands finding his shoulders, his arms wrapping around her waist. It wasn't desperate or rushed, but it was intense. All the weeks of growing connection, of careful conversations and meaningful glances, pouring into this moment. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard. "I shouldn't have done that," Michael said, though he didn't let her go. "Why not?" "Because my world is complicated. Because getting close to me puts you at risk. Because you deserve someone whose biggest problem is a difficult work schedule. Not," he gestured vaguely, encompassing everything he couldn't say directly. "Don't I get to decide what risks I'm willing to take? Emily, you told me once that you inherited everything your father built. His business, his reputation, his connections. But you didn't inherit his character, Michael. You're not him. You're trying to build something different even if you're having to do it from within the structure he created. That takes courage. Or stupidity. Maybe both." She smiled slightly. "But I see you trying. I see you coming to your father's grave and standing there like you're having an argument with a ghost. I see you thinking about this building and how to transform it. I see someone who wants to do better, be better. That's the person I'm choosing to trust." Michael pulled her close again, resting his forehead against hers. I don't deserve you. That's not how this works. It's not about deserving. It's about choosing. They stood like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other, the empty building silent around them. Emily felt the steady beat of his heart against her chest, felt the tension slowly leaving his body as he allowed himself to accept what was happening between them. This won't be easy, he warned. Nothing worth having is. People in my life that they won't understand. Some might see you as a weakness, something to exploit. Emily pulled back enough to look him in the eyes. Then we're careful. We're smart about it. But I'm not walking away because of what might happen. You're sure? I'm sure. He kissed her again, deeper this time, and Emily let herself fall into it, into him, into this impossible connection that had started at his father's grave and grown into something neither of them had expected. When they finally left the building, the night had fully settled over Newark. Michael drove her home, their hands linked across the center console, a comfortable silence replacing the need for words. At her building, he walked her to the door like a teenager on a first date, his usual confidence replaced with an uncertainty that Emily found endearing. When can I see you again? He asked. Tomorrow, cemetery. Same as always. That's not enough anymore. No, she agreed. It's not. But we start there. We build from what we know. He kissed her goodnight soft and lingering, a promise of more to come. Then he waited until she was safely inside before driving away, and Emily climbed the stairs to her apartment feeling like the world had shifted on its axis. The next few days were a blur of stolen moments and careful planning. They continued their cemetery walks, but now they held hands when no one was around. They met for early breakfasts before her shift started, found quiet corners of the city where they could talk without being observed. Michael was teaching her to be aware of surroundings, to notice when people paid too much attention, to understand the unspoken rules of his world. And Emily was teaching him something too. How to be present, how to find peace in small moments, how to build something real in the spaces between obligations and expectations. But reality has a way of intruding on even the most carefully constructed bubbles. It happened on a Friday afternoon. Emily was working near the cemetery entrance when a dark SUV pulled up, expensive, with tinted windows and an air of authority that immediately put her on alert. Two men got out, both wearing suits that screamed professional, in a way that had nothing to do with legitimate business. One was older, maybe 60, with silver hair and a face that had seen things Emily didn't want to imagine. The other was younger, perhaps 40, with cold eyes that assessed her the way a predator assesses prey. Emily Carter? The older one asked, his tone polite but carrying an undercurrent of threat. Who's asking? Friends of Michael Rossi. We wanted to have a conversation. Every instinct told Emily to run, but she forced herself to stay calm. I'm working. If you want to schedule a burial, you need to speak with the main office. This isn't about burials. The younger one stepped closer. This is about your relationship with Mr. Rossi. Emily's heart hammered, but she kept her expression neutral. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't insult our intelligence. The older man's smile didn't reach his eyes. You've been spending considerable time together. We're concerned about his judgment lately, about distractions that might affect his leadership. I help maintain the cemetery where his father is buried. We talk sometimes. That's all. Is it? The younger one pulled out his phone, showing her a photo. Emily and Michael kissing outside the empty building in University Heights. Because this suggests something more. Emily felt cold wash through her, but she refused to show fear. What do you want? We want you to understand something, the older man said, his voice dropping to conversational warmth that was somehow more threatening than anger would have been. Michael Rossi has responsibilities, important responsibilities that affect many people. Personal attachments can be problematic. They create vulnerabilities that can be exploited by people far less friendly than we are. Are you threatening me? We're educating you. He stepped back, adjusting his cuffs casually. Michael is at a crossroads. The choices he makes now will determine not just his future, but the futures of everyone connected to him. We're simply suggesting that you consider whether you want to be part of that equation. Michael makes his own choices. Does he? The younger one smiled coldly. Or does he make the choices his position allows? There's a difference. We'd hate to see anyone get hurt because they didn't understand that difference. They got back in their SUV and drove away, leaving Emily standing among the graves, her hands shaking with delayed reaction. She wasn't naive. She'd known getting involved with Michael meant entering dangerous territory, but having it confirmed so directly, Having physical evidence that they were being watched made it real, in a way it hadn't been before. She pulled out her phone and called Michael. "Hey," he answered, warmth in his voice. "I was just thinking about you. We need to talk. In person. Now." The warmth vanished. "What happened?" "Not over the phone. I'll be there in 15 minutes. He made it in 12, pulling up with barely controlled urgency. Emily met him at his car, and one look at her face told him everything he needed to know. "Who?" he asked, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Two men. Older one with silver hair, younger one with dead eyes. They knew about us, they had photos." Michael's jaw clenched. "Dominic and Carlos. My father's old advisors. They think they run things now. They threatened me. Politely, but still. They had no right." He stopped himself, breathing hard, visibly forcing calm. "You're right, we need to talk, but not here." They drove to a park neither had been to before, Michael constantly checking mirrors, taking random turns, making sure they weren't followed. When he finally parked in a secluded area, he turned to face her. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have anticipated this. Should have protected you better. You can't control everything. In my world, I have to try." He ran his hands through his hair, frustration and fear warring in his expression. "They're testing me, seeing if they can manipulate me through you. If I react too strongly, I show weakness. If I don't react, they think they can push further. What do we do?" Michael looked at her, and Emily saw him calculating, processing scenarios she couldn't imagine. "We have options. I can end this. Us. Publicly. Make it clear you mean nothing to me. They'd lose interest. Move on to other leverage points." Emily's heart sank, but she kept her voice steady. "Is that what you want?" "What I want doesn't matter. It's the only thing that matters." He reached for her hand, gripping it tightly. "I want you safe. That's what matters. And I want you to have a life beyond duty and expectations. We both want things, Michael. The question is whether we're willing to fight for them. Fighting means putting you at risk. I'm already at risk. They already know. Pulling back now won't erase that." Emily moved closer. "But maybe there's another option. Maybe instead of hiding what we are, we make it clear that threatening me threatens you. That we're a unit, not a vulnerability. That's dangerous. So is living half a life." Michael stared at her, and she could see him wrestling with it. The instinct to protect her versus the desire to claim what they'd built together. Finally, slowly, his expression hardened into something she hadn't seen before. Determination. "You're right," he said. "I've been trying to navigate their expectations, play by rules I never agreed to. But maybe it's time to establish new rules. My rules." "What does that mean?" "It means I stop apologizing for wanting something beyond what my father built. It means I acknowledge you publicly as someone important to me, and make it clear that anyone who threatens you answers to me directly." He cupped her face in his hands. "But Emily, you need to understand what that means. It means you become part of this world whether you want to or not. I'm already part of it. I just want to be part of it with you." He kissed her then, fierce and claiming, a kiss that tasted like decision and commitment and risk. When they pulled apart, both knew something fundamental had shifted. "No going back after this," Michael warned. "Good," Emily said. "I'm tired of going back." They sat in the car as darkness fell, hands linked, both knowing that everything was about to change. The dead, Emily had always believed, were honest in their silence. But the living had to speak their truths aloud even when it was dangerous, especially when it was dangerous. And she and Michael had just spoken theirs. The confrontation came faster than either of them expected. Michael made his position clear within 48 hours. He called a meeting with his father's old advisors, Dominic, Carlos, and 3 others who'd served Vincent Rossi for decades. Emily didn't attend, but Michael told her about it afterward, his voice tight with residual tension. "I informed them that my personal life is not subject to committee approval," he said. They were in her apartment, the first time he'd been there, sitting on her modest couch with coffee growing cold on the table. "I made it clear that anyone who approaches you again without my explicit permission will find themselves looking for new employment. Permanently." How did they take it? About as well as expected. Dominic argued I was being emotional, making decisions with my heart instead of my head. Carlos stayed quiet, which is more concerning. He's the dangerous one. He thinks strategy, not just reaction. Emily studied his face, seeing the exhaustion there. "You're scared. Terrified," he admitted. "Not for me. For you. I've just painted a target on your back by claiming you publicly. Or you've put a shield around me. They can't touch me now without directly defying you. Unless they decide I'm no longer worth following. Michael set down his untouched coffee. My father ruled through fear and absolute control. I'm trying to rule through respect and change. Some of them see that as weakness. Is it working, the change you're trying to make? He considered. In some ways. I've redirected 3 of our revenue streams into legitimate businesses. The building I showed you, I'm moving forward with the renovation, creating affordable housing. I've refused to engage in activities that cross certain lines. But it's slow, and not everyone agrees with the direction. Change is always slow. Sometimes it's too slow. He pulled her close, and Emily felt the tension in his body. I'm asking you to be patient with me, to trust that I'm moving us toward something better, even when it doesn't feel fast enough. I trust you, she said simply. They spent the evening planning small rebellions against the weight of his inherited world. Michael described the legitimate business ventures he wanted to pursue. Emily shared ideas about community programs that could operate from the renovated building. It felt like building a future brick by careful brick. But futures, Emily had learned from a decade among the dead, were never guaranteed. The call came on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Michael had drawn his line in the sand. Emily was at the cemetery preparing for a morning service when her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. Emily Carter? A voice she didn't recognize. Male. Calm. Yes? You need to listen very carefully. Michael Rossi has made some people very unhappy. You're going to help us remind him of his responsibilities. Ice flooded through her veins. Who is this? That doesn't matter. What matters is that you follow instructions exactly. When you leave work today, you'll see a black van in the parking lot. You'll get in quietly without making a scene. If you alert anyone, the police, Michael, anyone, the consequences will be severe. Do you understand? You can't. We can. And we will. This is business, Miss Carter. Nothing personal. Michael needs to remember what's important. You're simply a teaching tool. The line went dead. Emily stood frozen, her mind racing. She should call Michael immediately. She should call the police. She should run. But the voice had been so calm, so certain. These weren't amateurs making empty threats. And if she called for help, if she escalated this, what would they do? She looked around the cemetery, the peaceful rows of headstones, the ancient trees, the place where she'd always felt safe. It felt different now, exposed, vulnerable. Her hands shaking, she pulled out her phone and typed a text to Michael. Something's wrong. Don't call. I love you. She hit send before she could reconsider, then turned off her phone. Whatever was coming, she'd face it. And she'd trust that Michael would know what that text meant, would understand the message beneath the words. The hours until the end of her shift crawled by with agonizing slowness. Emily went through the motions of her work, her mind spinning through scenarios, trying to prepare for something she couldn't predict. She considered running, but where would she go? These people had found her at work. They clearly knew her routines, her vulnerabilities. At 4 o'clock, her shift ended. Emily walked to the parking lot with her heart hammering against her ribs. The black van was exactly where they'd said it would be. 2 men stood beside it, not the ones who'd confronted her before, but cut from the same cloth. Professional, dangerous, calm. Ms. Carter, one acknowledged. Please get in. This will go easier if you cooperate. Emily took a deep breath and made her choice. She got in. They took her to a warehouse in the industrial district, the kind of anonymous building that could hide anything. Inside, it was mostly empty except for a few chairs and harsh overhead lighting. They sat her down, not roughly but firmly, making it clear that compliance was her only option. Then they waited. Emily forced herself to stay calm, to breathe, to not let panic consume her. She thought about Michael, about the life they'd been trying to build together. She thought about her mother, about dignity in the face of fear. She thought about all the bodies she'd buried, all the endings she'd witnessed, and found a strange strength in that knowledge. Death came for everyone eventually, but she wasn't dead yet. After what felt like hours but was probably only 40 minutes, a phone rang. One of the men answered, listened, then handed it to her. Your boyfriend wants to talk to you. Emily took the phone with shaking hands. Michael, Emily, God, are you hurt? His voice was tight with barely controlled panic. I'm okay. They haven't hurt me. Listen to me very carefully. I'm going to fix this. I'm going to get you out. Just hold on. Michael. But the phone was pulled away. One of the men spoke into it, his tone businesslike. Here's how this works, Mr. Rossi. You have 24 hours to reconsider your recent decisions. Return things to how your father ran them, or Ms. Carter becomes an object lesson in why personal attachments are liabilities. We'll be in touch with specific demands. The call ended. The men returned to their waiting, and Emily sat in the uncomfortable chair, trying not to think about what object lesson might mean. Time became strange in the warehouse, stretching and contracting, marked only by the shifting quality of light through the high windows. Emily dozed fitfully, jolting awake at every sound. The men rotated shifts but maintained constant vigilance. They gave her water, allowed her to use a bathroom, treated her almost courteously. It was somehow more frightening than overt aggression would have been, this calm professionalism that suggested they'd done this before. She didn't know how much time had passed when she heard new sounds. Engines outside, raised voices, the sudden tension in her captor's postures. Then the warehouse door burst open. Michael stood in the entrance with 4 men behind him. Not the old guard, Emily realized, but younger faces, people who looked at him with loyalty rather than calculation. His expression was cold fury, barely contained, and when his eyes found her across the warehouse, something in him cracked. "Let her go," he said, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Now, Mr. Rossi, we had an agreement. We had no agreement. You made demands. I'm making one. Release her, or this ends very badly for everyone." The man who'd handed her the phone stepped forward. "You're outnumbered. We have 6 men here, you have 4. The math doesn't work in your favor." Michael smiled, and it was the most dangerous expression Emily had ever seen. "You're counting wrong. I don't need numbers, I need loyalty. Your men, look at them. They're following orders, but do they believe in what they're doing? Are they willing to face consequences for Dominic's power play?" Emily watched the warehouse dynamics shift. The men holding her exchanged glances, uncertainty creeping into their professional facades. They'd been told this was sanctioned, approved by the old guard. But Michael's presence, his confidence, made them question. "This ends one of 2 ways," Michael continued. "You release her now, and we discuss the future of our organization like rational adults, or this becomes a conflict that fractures everything my father built. Either way, Emily walks out of here unharmed." The standoff held for one breathless moment. Then one of the men near Emily stepped back, hands raised. "I'm not dying for politics," he said. "Let her go." Others followed, the unified front crumbling. The man who'd made the threat stared at Michael with pure hatred but eventually nodded. "This isn't over," he said. "Yes," Michael replied. "It is. You just don't know it yet." Emily stood on shaking legs, and Michael crossed the warehouse in quick strides, pulling her into his arms. She felt his heart racing against her chest, felt the tremor in his hands as he held her. "I've got you," he murmured. "I've got you. You're safe." They walked out together, Michael's men forming a protective circle. Emily's legs barely held her, adrenaline and relief making her dizzy. But Michael's arm around her waist kept her upright, kept her moving forward. In the car, finally alone, she let herself shake. Michael pulled her close, his own composure fracturing. "I thought I'd lost you," he said roughly. "When I got your text, when they called with demands. I've never been that scared in my life. How did you find me?" "Carlos. Turns out he was never really on Dominic's side. He called me, told me where they'd taken you. He's been documenting everything, all of Dominic's attempts to undermine me, all the illegal activities I've been trying to shut down." Michael pulled back enough to look at her. "It's over, Emily. Dominic and his faction are done. Carlos has enough evidence to ensure they either fall in line or face serious consequences. So you won? We survived. That's not the same as winning." He cupped her face gently. "But it's a start, a chance to rebuild things the right way." Emily leaned into his touch, exhausted but relieved. "Take me home. My place or yours? I don't care. Anywhere that's not here." He took her to his penthouse, a space she'd never seen, all clean lines and expensive emptiness. But with her there, held safe in his arms, it felt less like a showroom and more like a refuge. They didn't talk about the future that night. They just held each other, grateful for present and presence, for having survived the test that could have destroyed them both. Outside, Newark glittered in the darkness, a city full of stories and struggles. And somewhere in it, 2 people were learning that love in dangerous places required courage, but they'd always known that. Spring came to Newark with unexpected gentleness. 6 months had passed since the warehouse, and the city seemed to have transformed along with everything else. Or perhaps it was just that Emily saw it differently now, the way sunlight caught on windows, the sound of children playing in neighborhood parks, the resilience of communities that had weathered decades of hardship and still found reasons to celebrate. She stood at the entrance of the renovated building in University Heights, watching workers put finishing touches on what would officially open next week as the Vincent Rossi Community Center. The irony of the name wasn't lost on her. Michael had chosen it deliberately, reclaiming his father's legacy by transforming it into something that actually served people. The ground floor housed a cafe run by a cooperative of local immigrants, offering employment and gathering space. The second floor held affordable apartments for artists and young families. The third floor had become a community education center, offering free classes in everything from financial literacy to English as a second language. It was everything they'd envisioned that evening when Michael first brought her here, and so much more. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Michael's voice came from behind her. Emily turned, smiling at the sight of him. He looked different these days, lighter somehow, as if a weight he'd carried his entire life had finally been lifted. He still dressed well, still moved with that awareness of surroundings, but there was an ease to him now that hadn't existed before. "Just thinking about how far we've come," she said as he wrapped his arms around her waist. "We, you, me, this building, all of it." Michael kissed the top of her head. "Couldn't have done it without you. You know that, right? You would have found your way. Maybe, but it would have taken longer, been lonelier." He paused. "Carlos is officially retiring next month. He's recommending I bring in fresh leadership, people who share the vision of what we're building instead of what we're leaving behind." Emily turned in his arms to face him. "How do you feel about that?" "Relieved, scared, hopeful." He smiled slightly. "All of it at once. The old guard is mostly gone now. Some retired, some decided to work elsewhere when they realized I was serious about change. The organization is smaller than it was under my father, but it's cleaner, more legitimate. Is it enough? The legitimacy?" Michael considered. "It's not perfect. There are still gray areas, still connections to the past I can't completely sever, but we're moving in the right direction. The businesses we run now actually produce value instead of extracting it. We employ people fairly. We contribute to communities instead of exploiting them." He cupped her face. "It's not redemption exactly, but it's honest work toward something better. That's all anyone can do. Honest work toward better." They stood together in the spring sunshine, watching the city move around them. Emily thought about the journey that had brought them here, from his father's silent wake to this moment of hope and possibility. It hadn't been easy. There had been setbacks, confrontations, moments when the weight of the past seemed insurmountable, but they'd persisted, together. "I have something to show you," Michael said. "At the cemetery." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Mysterious. Trust me. Always." They drove to Hillside Cemetery in Michael's car, still the modest sedan he preferred for personal trips. The spring afternoon painted everything in soft gold, the trees beginning to bud, the grass impossibly green after winter's dormancy. Michael led her up the familiar path to the East Ridge, to his father's grave. Emily had been here countless times in the past months, often with Michael, sometimes alone when she was working. The headstone had been installed shortly after the burial. Simple granite with Vincent Rossi's name, dates, and nothing else. No sentiment, no epitaph, just facts. But today, something was different. Next to Vincent's headstone stood another, newer, smaller, its granite a slightly different shade. Emily moved closer, reading the inscription. "In memory of those who couldn't choose their beginning but chose their ending with courage." Below that, a list of names. Emily recognized some, people who'd worked for Vincent Rossi and died in the course of that work. Their sacrifices never officially acknowledged. Others were unfamiliar, but each name represented a life, a story, a person who'd been caught in the machinery of the organization and lost. "I spent months researching," Michael said quietly, standing beside her. "Talking to people, looking through old records. These are the people my father's choices affected, directly or indirectly. People who died because of decisions he made, conflicts he started, violence he permitted." Emily felt tears prick her eyes. "Michael, I can't bring them back, can't undo what was done, but I can acknowledge them, remember them, make sure they're not just forgotten casualties." He gestured to the memorial stone. "This is my promise to them, to myself, to you, that I won't forget the cost of the world I inherited. that every decision I make will be weighed against the question, who pays the price? Emily took his hand, squeezing tightly. This was what she'd seen in him from the very beginning, standing in the rain at his father's burial, this capacity for reflection, for growth, for choosing to be better than what he'd been born into. "There's one more thing," Michael said. He pulled a small box from his pocket and Emily's heart began to race. He didn't kneel. This wasn't a performance for an audience. He simply opened the box, revealing a simple ring with a single stone that caught the afternoon light. "I'm not going to promise you an easy life," he said. "My past will always be complicated. There will always be people who judge you for choosing me, who question whether someone with my history deserves happiness. And I'm not going to pretend I'm fully redeemed or that I've completely escaped what my father built, Michael, but I can promise you honesty, effort, a commitment to keep building something better every single day. And I can promise you love, the kind that sees your worth and honors it, that grows stronger through challenges instead of breaking." He met her eyes. "Emily Carter, will you marry me?" Emily looked at him, this man who'd been born into darkness but chose to walk toward light, who carried the weight of his father's sins but refused to be defined by them, who'd found in a cemetery worker someone who saw him as he truly was instead of what his name represented. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "Yes, I'll marry you." He slid the ring onto her finger and they kissed there among the graves, surrounded by endings that had somehow led to this beginning. The wedding was small, held 3 months later in Branch Brook Park under the cherry trees. Only close friends attended, Martin from the cemetery, Rosa from Felipe's diner, Carlos and a handful of Michael's new associates who believed in what he was building, and Emily's cousin Sarah, the only family member who'd stayed in touch after her mother's death. They wrote their own vows. Michael promised to honor her independence and strength, to never take her for granted, to build a life worthy of her trust. Emily promised to stand beside him through the continued work of transformation, to remind him of who he was choosing to be when the past threatened to reclaim him, to love him, not despite his complexity, but because of it. When they were pronounced married, the small gathering erupted in genuine celebration. These were people who understood the unlikeliness of this union, the courage it required from both of them, the hope it represented. At the reception, held at the community center naturally, Emily found herself standing by the windows overlooking the neighborhood, watching the evening settle over the city. Michael joined her, sliding an arm around her waist. "What are you thinking, Mrs. Rossi?" She smiled at the name, still getting used to it. "I'm thinking about your father's wake, how empty it was, how no one came to say goodbye. Why? Because I'm imagining yours someday, hopefully many, many decades from now, and I'm picturing this room full of people whose lives you touched, who benefited from your choices, who'll remember you for what you built instead of what you inherited." She turned to face him. "That's the legacy you're creating, not wealth or power, but genuine positive impact." Michael pulled her close. "You know what I think about?" "What?" "I think about a gravedigger who stayed when everyone else left, who saw a man at his lowest moment and chose compassion instead of judgment, who believed I could be better before I believed it myself." He kissed her forehead. "You saved me, Emily, in the most literal sense. We saved each other," she corrected. "You gave me a reason to build a life instead of just marking time between burials. You reminded me that endings can lead to beginnings." They danced as the evening deepened, surrounded by people who'd become their chosen family. Carlos made a toast about transformation and second chances. Sarah cried happy tears and told embarrassing stories from Emily's childhood. Rosa presented them with a gift certificate to Felipe's diner, good for 1 lunch per week for the next year. "To make sure you remember where you started," she said with a knowing smile. Later, as they prepared to leave for a modest honeymoon, a week in a cabin upstate, no agenda beyond being together, Emily and Michael made one final stop. They drove to Hillside Cemetery as midnight approached. The gates technically closed, but Emily still had keys. They walked hand in hand through the darkness up the familiar path to the East Ridge. Vincent Rossi's grave looked peaceful in the moonlight, the memorial stone beside it honoring all those forgotten casualties. Emily thought about how death revealed truth, not in dramatic ways but in quiet ones. Who showed up? Who stayed? What was built from what remained? "Do you ever wish he could see what you've become?" Emily asked. Michael was quiet for a long moment. "Sometimes. Not for his approval. I don't need that anymore, but maybe for his understanding." To know that his choices didn't have to define mine. That legacy can be transformed. I think he knows, Emily said. Wherever he is, whatever he is now, I think he knows you chose differently. They stood together in the silence of the cemetery, the living among the dead, past and future intertwining. Emily had spent a decade in this place, learning lessons from endings. But tonight, standing beside her husband, she understood something new. The most profound endings weren't about death at all. They were about having the courage to let old versions of yourself die so new ones could emerge. Michael had buried more than his father in this ground. He'd buried expectations, patterns, the suffocating weight of inherited destiny. And from that burial, he'd grown something new, something honest, something worthy, something that honored life, instead of extracting from it. Ready to go? Michael asked. Emily took one last look at the graves, at the memorial, at the place where their story had begun. Ready, she said. They walked back through the cemetery hand in hand, leaving the dead to their rest. Behind them, the memorial stone gleamed in the moonlight, a promise kept, a past acknowledged, a future earned through difficult choices and persistent courage. The gates of Hillside Cemetery closed behind them with a soft click, and Emily and Michael drove into the night, into the life they'd built together, into a future where endings and beginnings existed in perfect balance, where love proved stronger than legacy, where the dead taught the living how to truly choose life.